You ever thought about, in order to be humble, you got to be humiliated? Let's talk about that. I'm Zach with The Average Christian, and this project is simply about discovering a relationship with God by looking at truth, by looking at practicality. How do I live this thing out? And dispelling the myths about Christianity. So this video is about 5 ways to be more humble, to be humiliated. It's interesting because really that's the truth. You got to be humiliated. People are like, oh God, I just need more humility. What do you think is going to happen? You're going to be stomped down to some degree and beat up a little bit in order to be humble because you got to starve pride. I have lots of embarrassing stories, some of which you don't want to know, maybe all of which you don't want to know. But I remember, in where we go to church, serving on the Lord's table, it's kind of funny because it's a little formal, and it doesn't have to be that way, but it's sort of tradition that you have some guys stand up front and they lead prayer and pass around. They'll say the bread, but it's really cracker. And then you come back all together at the front, and you pass out the juice and call it the fruit of the vine, and then pray over it and to drink it and all, whatever. So anyway, I'm up, and where we're going to church, there's 5 of us, and there's 2 on the outsides that will cover the pews, and then there's one in the middle who doesn't leave. He just stands up there. He's called the head of the table or whatever, and he just says the prayers and waits on the rest of them. So I'm that guy. I'm like 13, 14 years old, and I'm scared to death because I'm leading prayer in front of a bunch of people. And so I get up there in my white shirt and my black pants. And the funny thing about the head of the table is he's got to stand up there and eat that cracker in front of everybody. So I'm already shaking, like I got palsy. And then you got to pick out that little bit of juice. Well, I barely got any juice in my mouth because I spilled it down my white shirt. And then I sat down with my buddy afterwards, finally done with this. And underneath my black pants is my white underwear that everybody had to see because my fly was wide open the whole time. And so you think, man, I'm really doing a good thing for the Lord here. And yeah, there's plenty of stories like that, but that's that humiliation. So let's talk about 5 ways to be humble. The first one is don't be insane. Now, I'm going from Romans chapter 12 I'm going to take verses 3 and 16. All right. So let me read these for you, and I'm going to come back to them through these 5 points. The first one is don't be insane. And I'll explain that if you just stay with me for a little bit. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, in verse 3, Romans 12, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Live in harmony with one another. In verse 16, do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. So the first one is don't be insane. Now, what do I mean by that? Look, we volunteered for this, right? If you go to Romans chapter 6, back a few chapters, I volunteered to be what? A slave. Now, God didn't see me that way or see you that way as a child of his, but I volunteered to be a slave, right? Now, how can a slave be arrogant? See, it just doesn't work, right? That's the definition of insanity. In fact, let me show you insanity. And maybe one of the ugliest things in the Bible. In Luke 18, 10 through 12, you can read this. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus. Listen to how this dude prayed. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men. That bum over there is what he's thinking specifically. Extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. You see, he's saying, I thank you, God, that I'm not like these fools over here. Some of us as Christians think this way. Like, I don't do drugs and I ain't murder nobody and I'm not sleeping around because my sins are little and theirs are big. And I'm not this guy. But this tax collector that was like, you got to read up on that. I don't have the time to explain it right now. But he's, looked at very lowly. And he says, I'm glad I'm not like this tax collector. And then he tells God, you're lucky to have me on your team. Why? Because I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. And Jesus was not happy with that example. And that is drunk on your own power and your own inability. And it talks about sober judgment. As I read there from Romans 12, I'll tie in the insanity thing, but it's insane to be arrogant about your Christianity. That's the ugliest, stupidest thing I can think of. Look how good I am for God. Well, you didn't earn nothing else but hell just the same as me. We've all, if we're talking about earning, we've all earned the same thing. It's by God's grace and through the faith that he's asked of us that we get to be anyone and so forth. So it's being drunk on your own power. You have talent and abilities, but what have you really done? And look, he says, going back here in Romans 12, he says to not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. You ought to value yourself. So should I. You should look at yourself and appreciate. You know, if you're going to love other people as yourself, you got to love you first. I've said that a few times. So you got to value yourself, but not to think more highly. Appreciate your talents, appreciate the way God's made you, and have that sense of, well, for lack of a better term, to have that sense of appreciation. But you didn't earn nothing. You didn't earn salvation. And we are not stacking chips with God to say, hey, you owe me at judgment. Number 2, keep your hands down. What do you do when you win a race, when you win a game, when things go well? Arms go up. Keep your hands down. Now, why would I bring that up? Because in the word haughty, which I think is kind of a funny word, but anyway, the idea behind that arrogance, that haughty, that word in the Greek language is having your hands up in the air, because it's basically saying, look what I've done. Look at me. It can be a celebration. I understand maybe it doesn't always fit with that metaphor in sports, but that's the basic thing. Keep your hands down. Stop drawing attention to yourself. Jesus never, ever drew attention to himself, right? I mean, even after the resurrection, which is why I hate Jesus paintings, most of them, because he's pretty and he's bright white, which is a problem all in and of itself. And he's got a glow around him and he seems to be floating and everybody else is uglier and dirtier than him. That's not how Jesus rolled. Jesus was average. That's why a lot of people missed him. And he's telling us to be exactly like him. Well, put your hands down and stop drawing attention to yourself. And when you look at John 20 and 21 and Luke 24, even after the resurrection, Jesus wasn't drawing attention to himself. And was revealing himself to a limited number of people. And so I don't need to be doing that either. I don't need people to see me. I know that that's a lot of our materialism, is I want people to see me in this brand of clothing or in this brand of car or this size house or whatever it is. And that's why we sort of fake it on social media and so forth. But that's really what's behind modesty. You know, you hear that word a lot of times in church groups and things, and you hear modesty and you automatically think, don't wear short skirts or don't dress like this or whatever else. The idea really behind modesty is don't draw any unnecessary attention to yourself, and don't even use righteousness to do it. I can't say again how ugly this is to brag about your righteousness or your goodness. And none of us is good without the Lord. And it's hard to get people to own that too, because I've been talking about this to certain people and they'll be, oh, I know I hate that so much, this person over here. And a lot of times it's me and you. We want other people to see us and we want to brag. And humility means putting our hands down, and looking for honor and praise from humanity is really just foolish and a waste of time and useless. And let me give you some. In fact, it makes me look like a fool to God if I need your attention that much and your approval that much. Now, you're talking to somebody who's struggled with self-esteem his whole life. Not as much now, thank the Lord, thank my wife and my children, but especially growing up, any of you who are watching this who knew me as a teenager, knew me at camp, knew me at high school, God forbid, but you understand what I was like and how fake I was. And it was because I wanted people to like me and I wanted their approval. Well, that makes me look foolish to God. Proverbs 11:2, let me give you a few here. Proverbs 11:2 says, when pride comes, then comes shame, but with the humble is wisdom. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Haughty. Proverbs 18 and verse 2, I can't get that guy out of my head. A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. Did you hear that? I'm going to do that one more time. Proverbs 18:2, a fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. Proverbs 29 and 23, a man's pride will bring him low, but the humble in spirit will retain honor. Matthew 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So keep your hands down. Number 3 of how you're going to stay humiliated, how you're going to stay humble is, or be humble, is to realize you can't measure personal wisdom. Never be wise, he says there at the end of verse 16 in Romans 12. Never be wise in your own sight. You know why? Because you can't measure it, because you lack objectivity. It's like looking at a picture or hearing a recording of your voice. Ever done that? You ever been embarrassed to hear yourself? I know one guy that quit leading singing at a congregation where he went because they would have like singing night, and he went to the back one time, heard somebody else leading singing, and it was just his voice, like a solo. When you went to the back out in the foyer, or whatever you want to call it, he was like, never again, ain't nobody gonna hear just my voice singing, because it makes you feel weird and you think you sound a certain way until you hear it. Try doing some videos like this. I remember the first time watching and we released, and it was like, what? You look different than you thought. You sound different than you thought. It's like, how many of us have looked and said, man, I need to lose weight? Because you look at yourself, without any reflection or a mirror to look in, and you say, well, I ain't that bad, because you're looking from a different angle. Then you get in a mirror or you see a picture or a video and you go, oh no, it's that bad and worse. See, that same thing with wisdom. You can't judge yourself to be wise because you lack that objectivity. Let me show you a couple of verses. Proverbs 26 and verse 12. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. Proverbs 3:7. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. And it's God that measures wisdom. Check out James 3 sometime, 13 through 17. It's the wisdom from above and God that measures that wisdom. So don't think about how smart you are, how much you know, how long you've been around, and how much experience you've acquired. Don't be wise in your own sight because you can't measure personal wisdom. Number 4, let's get number 4 in real quick. Number 4 is be sober. Now, I told you earlier, don't be insane. And I use that insane word for a reason. Let's go back to the text. But think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. So be sober. When you hear that word, you automatically think drunk. But I mentioned how we can be drunk on our own power and drunk on our own love of ourselves and drunk on our own self-esteem and so forth. And it's to be sober is to have a clear head, a clear mind. That's why the Lord doesn't want us smoking weed or drinking or whatever, is so we can have that clarity, and we want to protect that. Solomon was righteous in asking for wisdom. 1 Kings chapter 3, before he ever had all the money and all the women and all of the wisdom and knowledge, the only thing that he asked from God was, please give me the ability to discern between good and evil so I can judge your people, because I'm just not able to do it. And God was so impressed with that simple plea for wisdom, but Solomon lost his mind to the women that he married, to all the stuff that he had. When he gained all these things, that's when he really went out of his mind, started acting insane, talking about how great he is and how much he'd accomplished and how much he'd done. But how many would have seen him as successful? It was the Queen of Sheba that just was beside herself and said, I've never heard of anybody like this. I've never seen anybody like this, never talked to anybody like this. We looked at it and said, well, that was successful. But in a spiritual sense, he was acting insane. He was drunk on his own power and his own value of self. When he first started out and he prayed to God, he had the proper humility because he had the proper view of himself, because in his sobriety, he said, please just give me the wisdom to judge. The root word, by the way, the reason why I used insanity to begin with, was because the root word in the original language behind sober is sane, to rescue from danger. Being of sober thought is rescuing you from danger. So have that sobriety and that clear head and clear view of yourself, your limitations, and that humility will allow you to pull from the resource, which is God. Number 5, last one, to accomplish and help accomplish humility. And this is straight from the Bible here. He says in Romans 12:16, live in harmony with one another. Well, it's a lot easier to do it when you act like this. Do not be haughty. Do not be arrogant. Do not be proud, but associate with the lowly. And of course, like we mentioned, never be wise in your own sight. That one phrase there, associate with the lowly, with the humble, associate with humility. And you know these people. I'm going to mention right off my brother-in-law. He gets embarrassed about this, but my brother-in-law, Martin Montgomery, he's one of the most humble people. And so many people are attracted to this guy and want to be around this guy and enjoy spending time with him because he is really interested in you, and he is so little about self and the arrogance and the impressing you with things that don't matter. He's just genuine. And so I aspire to be like that, and it motivates me, and you appreciate being around somebody like that. And he's telling us here, spend time with those people. That's not hard to do. Those people are easy to spend time with. Associate with the lowly. Those are the people, though, who have a low view of self in a healthy way. They may be looked at as lowly by the rest of the world. You know, there are so many people I've mentioned in other videos that I've missed out on great relationships with because earlier on they didn't meet up to a standard. They didn't meet where I was trying to be, or they weren't going to help me out in some way, socially speaking. And that was years ago, but it's still pathetic. And I still think about those people who I could have known, who were genuinely good people, that I missed out on because of judging by appearances and dumb things that don't even matter. And it says to be carried away with humility. That's really the thought behind this here. Knowing people who, you know, get carried away with talking about themselves. I am a salesman to a degree, and I realize and I know that one of the ways to get you to spend your money or to get you to believe in what I'm telling you is to talk about you, or to let you talk about you. That's one of the easiest ways to have a conversation. There's your conversational tip. You want to get it rolling, ask people about themselves, because most people want to talk about themselves. And instead of getting carried away with that, get carried away with this humility, like Barnabas is an example here of somebody who was carried away with the wrong example. If you look at Galatians chapter 2, Peter was setting a bad example of doing exactly what we're talking about now. He wanted to be around the Gentiles. Remember, there's a big divide between Jews and Gentiles back then. And he wanted to be around the Gentiles, the Christians who were Gentile background, until the Jews came around. And then he switched the way he acted. And that pride and Jewish, for him, the Jewish arrogance kicked in. And Barnabas sort of went along with this and went along with that pride because Peter set the opposite example. So instead, spend time with the humble, the people that we can so easily be attracted to, like I've mentioned, and submit to lowly things and lowly conditions. What do you think Jesus did? And Jesus was sweating. You know, did he have the smoothest looking camel to ride? Were these the brand new Air sandals, or, you know, whatever that I'm walking through the desert with? Is this the new Gucci robe that, you know, wearing out in the desert? You know what I'm saying? He didn't care about that kind of stuff. We care even now, like what brands of foods we're eating. It just gets ludicrous and ridiculous. Instead, subject yourself to lowly things. You see my brother-in-law, man, he's wearing who knows what kind of shirt. It's probably been handed down. He probably paid as little as he possibly can. He doesn't care that you make fun of him about drinking his watered down Kool-Aid because he's trying to save a few pennies, because that's just how he rolls, and that's just who he is, and he'll wear whatever hat looks good. And none of that matters to him. So submit yourselves to situations and the things that you don't deserve. I mean, if it's like, I deserve this, I deserve to be here, and I deserve to be respected, and I deserve blah, blah, blah. But submit yourself to people and situations that you quote unquote don't deserve. And remember, God's discipline brings humility. Hebrews chapter 12 talks about if we're children of God, then we have to be disciplined by God. I don't know how he does that, but I know he does. I know he allows the devil to do things to people. I know that he does discipline us to try to set us in the right direction, just like a parent does and would. God does that, and that humbles us as well. And know how to be brought low. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 12, Paul said, I understand that. That's right before the famous verse, 4:13, I can do all things through Christ. But he said, I know how to abound, how to be content in every circumstance. I know how to be brought low. Do you know? Do you understand what it means to be brought low? I'm afraid if you don't get this now, and I don't get this now, the Lord may humble us at the worst time, which is at judgment. So learn how to be brought low and stay low to the ground, deferring attention to others. And success is keeping your head low to a degree. I understand the parameters here, but success is keeping your head low. So number one, don't be insane. Number 2, keep your arms down. Let God measure wisdom. Be sober and associate yourself with humility. I thank you for watching this video. I hope that you will subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell to keep up with new releases. Check us out on the podcast. All of these have audio in podcast form, so you can listen while you're driving. You can check that on iTunes. There's Project Think. There's the YTV audio. There's this gravy podcast that Clayton and I are doing just for some fun. You can see those on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Spotify, on Google Play. You can go to the website as well and get involved there. And I hope you'll be back soon.